Welcome everybody to another episode of Ganbei. I'm your host Art Dicker, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Cameron Johnson. Welcome, Cameron.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So Cameron is the head of Asia Strategy at FAO Global, and as well as a partner at Tidalwave Solutions. Long-time China hand, been here for 20 years. Today the episode is about manufacturing and supply chain in China. So it's going to be a good one. We're going to cover a lot of good issues, some important issues. So Cameron, maybe you could walk us through a brief introduction of your China story, your experience. I'm sure the audience would love to hear.
Sure. I came to China first in the summer of '99. I ended up in a small college up in Chongqing called Waibo Yushuiyuan. It was an interesting time in Chongqing because they had just opened up their first McDonald's. So I really got the China experience of living in an older city, but also, the experience of, I celebrated my 20th birthday party in the McDonald's there at the train station. So it was quite an interesting experience.
Did they give you a happy?
No, they did not. They did not. But I do remember after a month living in the hinterland at the school, it was a feast of burgers and French fries.
I remember those days. Yeah, around the same time here as well. Yeah, that was good times.
Yeah, particularly, when you just came off the boat, so to speak. So
right.
I needed a piece of home. So after a couple years, I moved. I went back to the States actually for a year, and then September 11th hit, and then I came back. So I ended up in Shanghai. I started working again more in the English area. I got into the Microsoft joint venture Microsoft, where I was essentially a English language training expert, and then worked my way up over almost a decade to running a department. Then after that, I had my own company for a while. That didn't work out so well, so I decided to work for another company that was servicing Costa Coffee. So I helped build part of Costa Coffee's supply chain over the years, particularly with manufacturing cups and napkins and stir sticks. And then after that, I got into carbon fiber. So I was the Asia head for a carbon fiber manufacturer here, and we produced material for aerospace and automotive, sporting goods. So most of the hockey sticks in the world, for example, had material coming out of our factory at one point or another.
Okay.
And now I decided to move more into the consulting and project phase, so that's why Tidalwave and FAO Global came along, and I decided to take that opportunity.
Today we do want to talk about manufacturing and supply chain, and I wanted to start off with there's a lot of people talking about how manufacturing is leaving China, and people were talking about this and seeing this before COVID-19 hit. How much truth is there to that, and how much do you, if so, how much do you see COVID-19 and some of the disruptions caused by that accelerating that trend, and what kind of manufacturing is staying, what kind of manufacturing is leaving?
So a lot of manufacturing, or the manufacturing exodus, as they say, started probably around the time of the election of Trump. And a lot of that had to do with just natural forces, rising wages, more beneficial tax policies in other areas. And it first started moving from the eastern seaboard into more of the central areas or western areas of China. After that, then it started to go to Vietnam, Thailand, and Southeast Asia. So that was the primary driver was the wage cost. What happened when the trade war occurred was an acceleration.
Yeah.
And instead of just maybe a shoe factory or an apparel factory, then you started to see other component manufacturing, some electronics, other parts, some automotive, moving partly because of labor, but also partly because they were getting killed with tariffs into the U.S. Yeah. So what's happened now after COVID is you see more of a stabilization because of the fact that it's hit so many companies so hard. There is not as much movement right now as you would think. A lot of companies are just holding on, trying to maintain that they have an okay year and not a loss. Others are just reevaluating their plants. And COVID-19, while it's really hit them in the pocketbook, has actually given a bit of a pause so they can evaluate, do we want to diversify away from China? Do we want to have a China plus one or plus two strategy? One of the areas China has going for, which I'm sure we'll get into, is just the ecosystem of production it has here. If you're making an electronics product, the fact that almost everything you would need is within your area is something that no other country in the world has. So what we see, while costs will increase labor-wise and maybe material-wise, the fact that that ecosystem is still intact is one of the driving forces for keeping manufacturing here.
Yeah, and you can't just pick up that ecosystem and replicate it overnight in another market. We hear a lot of manufacturing is moving to Vietnam and Southeast Asia, but I imagine that at some point either hits a saturation point or the ecosystem is not there. You can't. It's the DNA, right? You can't just pick that up and build that someplace else.
That's right. I mean, one of the statistics last year that was used heavily was that if you move 10% of the container capacity from China into Southeast Asia, you would have to upgrade 40% of the ports, or the ports would all have to have a 40% upgrade, if not more, and that just isn't realistic within the time frame. I mean, it takes a long time, many years, if not a decade or more, to actually upgrade facilities to handle that. Last year, we met with the Vietnamese investment ministry, or the Minister of Investment, and we were discussing the challenges of infrastructure and shipping. Particularly some of our clients, they do have manufacturing in Cambodia or Vietnam or even now Laos, and they want to have more robust transportation between all points so they can move goods back and forth. And the answer we got back was, well, we're working on building roadways, but it's going to take us 5 to 10 years. Mm. And one of the comments from the delegation was, well, China could do it in 6 months. Right. So why don't you figure it out? So one of the challenges also is just that. Well, the other thing is that Vietnam's population is 1/7 of China's. Yes. So when you get to the economies of scale, the ecosystems, also the economies of scale with that, it's quite challenging to do that when you just don't have the populace or the landmass.
Right. Well, now, COVID-19 was obviously quite disruptive. So the flip side to that of having all your manufacturing in China and everything here is that everything's here. And when China shut down for 2 months in late January and February and early March, that was obviously caused some companies maybe to think about having too much manufacturing in China. Do you see that playing out now that we've gone through COVID and still going through COVID? Companies reevaluating their risk of having too much manufacturing concentrated in one place?
Oh, we do. But there's two components to that. The first component is if you're in China for China. Okay. So you're really not going to move anywhere. I mean, you might tweak it. Maybe you move from a Shenzhen maybe to a Beihai or more to the interior. But you're not really going to move outside of China. Mm. If you're a large manufacturer and you're getting components from around the world, what you'll start to see is companies move critical components to different areas. So to your point, if one area goes down, in this case China, you'll still be able to get it from another country. Mm. What we see now with the new USMCA, which is the new NAFTA agreement in the US, Canada, and Mexico, a lot of companies are starting to move some even minor manufacturing to Mexico so they have that backup support. So if something happens in Asia, they at least have a support and they have some capability of still manufacturing in North America.
Mm. Yeah, which in theory they could ramp up to a certain extent, right?
That's true. Yep.
How about Chinese manufacturers themselves then? So again, they ironically have a similar problem, right? If they're here and only here, and they're also, if they're primarily in the exporting business, maybe not diversified enough. Do you see them starting to move out because of that same risk? And if so, they must be running into problems of culture, cultural intelligence, kind of meshing with new cultures, new countries, sort of the regulatory regimes, and the fact that also some of the companies that they're used to working with may not be there. They can't go alone, right, by themselves to a new market or a new manufacturing hub. That's
right. I mean, one of the benefits that Chinese companies generally have in China is that they understand the market, and there's also an ecosystem that helps support them. There have been challenges, for example, in Vietnam, where Chinese manufacturers who manufactured apparel or shoes, some of them have actually returned to China because it was just too complicated to deal with, Vietnamese law, Vietnamese workers. It's just a different style. I think what we'll start to see is high-end manufacturing. So, of course, most have seen the Netflix documentary of American Factory, where Fuyao Glass went into, I think it's Ohio, and they bought the plant. So I think we'll start to see more of that. although the trade war and the current friction, all of those plans have been slowed down.
Sure.
So Chinese companies, they will look to go into other areas, Southeast Asia, maybe parts of Africa. A lot do want to go into India, but because, again, the political challenges, it makes it unpalatable. So they'll look for other areas and solutions to do that. And what we see, to your point, really, there is a cultural challenge, but also just the fact that these companies generally are so big.
Right.
When you take a large Chinese manufacturer, even SOE here, and you put them in another country, they're so massive and they suck up so much resources and time and attention that this is also something that these countries haven't really experienced before. So there is an adjustment period on both sides.
Fair enough. Yeah. There's not so many places they can go, right? And that could absorb them. That makes sense. How about, one thing we talked about earlier before we were recording, we talked about sort of this trend of digitalization in manufacturing and how you described it as sort of a top-down, the buyers at the top end pushing their suppliers at each tier to capture more of the data and even share some of that data, be transparent about that, whether it's from the cost of some of the inputs that go into it and so forth. Do you see that process really accelerating now? Do you see any sort of reluctance on the part of companies to get on board with that digitalization for whatever reason?
So large companies like an Apple, for example, already do parts of this where they have a non-conflict materials report and audit that all suppliers have to fulfill to make sure that they aren't getting materials from conflict countries. 3M, for example, has a digitalization process where they will essentially barcode or tag the tree itself all the way through the entire process to when the paper is made and actually put on the shelf. So we will see, different companies like that. Aerospace, of course, and that's one we've talked about heavily. That has, because if a part fails, you need to know why and who made it and where it was and all the different things that went into it, because people can die. So what we are seeing is some companies really push hard on their suppliers, and it's not just OEMs or tier 1 suppliers, it's most of the supply chain to actually digitalize, and some of it has to do with traceability and compliance. Others, though, does have to do with cost. We see in some industries in China where some companies don't want to do that because they prefer the gray area.
Yeah. That's where their margin is, right?
It's where the margin is. It's also where there's flexibility. For example, there are certain sporting good manufacturers who, if the customer orders a carbon fiber hockey stick or something, carbon fiber golf club, sometimes they'll use domestic carbon fiber because the customer just said, we don't care, just give us carbon fiber.
Right.
Domestic carbon fiber often is cheaper than imported carbon fiber. So if they actually had to trace everything, that advantage would be gone. So with that, though, you also have a hesitation, particularly on SMEs. The lower you go, is to how much cost it's actually going to be. And if it doesn't work, what do you do then? So not only do you have to buy a system, have it maintained, you have to design something for your own processes, you have to train your staff, somebody has to go around and make sure it's actually done. So it actually adds a lot more work to the company itself, and without getting a lot of benefit. They can't charge more for the part or for the material to an Apple, for example, because an Apple's going to say this is part of the cost of doing business. So a lot of companies are very hesitant overall to do that for those reasons.
But at the same time, would it be fair to say that to the extent that this kind of digitalization is becoming more and more important in manufacturing, that China is pretty well positioned to lead that digitalization effort? Because we talked about this earlier as well. It's not just that in manufacturing you see a lot more sensors and capturing of data here in China, but data is captured in logistics, in everyday life here. This is a very digital society by nature compared to almost any other place in the world. Do you think that that kind of familiarity with capturing and processing data in general in China also plays out in manufacturing and gives China a unique environment to do that compared to other places?
Yeah, absolutely. I think China is at the forefront of every major technology in relation to manufacturing, whether it's, to your point, to the data, using it on the cloud, AI, analytics, robotics, automation. They're at the forefront of every major technology in the world. And part of it is because there's such a large focus on moving up to the next stage of manufacturing. Some of it has to do with the shrinking labor pool. Others just that they want to improve their business, and this is the way they can actually make more money longer term. I think in the West, in some conversations about manufacturing in the U.S., for example, and say we want to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. That's true. Some of it will come back. Often, or at the moment, probably will be more in pharmaceuticals and medical supplies, maybe high-end parts that are critical to national security. But manufacturing, as we know, will never return to the U.S. as what it was before. And so how do you then manufacture? Well, you have to go into the robotics and the automation and the digitalization and the cloud-based analytics and everything. And that is something I think America's poised to do very well, can actually compete on an incredibly high level, even against China. But they also have to have the will and the foresight to do that. And at the moment, the only real countries that are doing that are Japan, Korea, China, who have more of a centralized focus of we want to move to this level, so we're going to kind of cajole and encourage, some gently, some forcefully, in a certain direction. I think the other thing is just market forces. Here, if you're not innovating, you're not moving forward, you're not going to have business. And in the U.S., that isn't necessarily the case at the moment. It's still more driven by cost, more driven by, do we buy America, these kinds of things, which are all important. But if you really want to take a step forward into the 21st, even the 22nd century, you really have to be at the forefront of those technologies and implementation.
And are those technologies ready? We saw that Meidi here in China bought KUKA, the German robotics manufacturing company. We hear that Foxconn is trying to become more and more using robots more and more. But is that still sort of something that's being implemented or to be implemented, or is that really already in full force being implemented, would you say?
Implementation on a rudimentary level, right? Okay. Robotics for automotive, for example. Most countries have this technology. Automation of some form. Most countries have variations of that within businesses. But when you talk about cutting edge, most are still in their infancy. For example, the amount of data that's produced by Alibaba and Tmall, they're just now starting to scratch the surface. The number of users they use WeChat every day, and all of the the WeChat mini programs and all the things, they're just beginning to scratch the surface of that data analytics. Even on Facebook, where they have a lot of that information, of course, you see the privacy pushback, but they're only in the beginning stages of understanding really what's going on with their systems and how people are actually using it.
So now, let's go back to the capturing of data we mentioned earlier. One of the things about data is it's not this fungible thing, right? It's in order to analyze data, you need to have, as I understand it, common standards, both at how the data is captured, how different, let's say in industrial IoT, how different machines talk to each other, transmit data to each other, and then who's coming up with the standards for these things? I imagine you have different component manufacturers that are being used, equipment is being used in the manufacturing process. So how do these standards work, and who's setting these standards, and how does it all get integrated together?
All good questions, much of which is being used. I mean, generally the language of machines and robotics, automation, is the same in most places in the world. It's Python, it's C++, it's Java, JavaScript. But when you get to beyond that to the actual standardization, right? ISO, for example, has a new certification, but it's for digital only. It has nothing to do. For example, if you have a paper document, you convert it to digital, that ISO does not apply to it. What we're starting to see is some creation, but the standards also, I would argue, are not there on a broad scale. You have certain industries, like automotive, for example, that's used robotics for years, who have a certain standard about how robotic arms should work, how many parts per hour or whatever many parts per car they should do. So those are fairly well known, but to your point, the actual standardization and is there a centralized body, there really isn't. So, and it's going to be those countries who are at the forefront of the technologies and development. So one of the worries, I think, of some manufacturers, particularly in the West, is that Chinese manufacturers because they're at the forefront, can actually dictate a lot of this, and they don't necessarily like that. Some of it is because just the competition aspect. I would argue others are, it's a misunderstanding of how China actually works and how fast things move. And I think there's a third component of just, it's an unknown. There really hasn't been, on a global scale, these types of technologies that impact such a broad base. You've normally had, for example, in aerospace where it started in the US or Europe, and they naturally grew over decades, and then, systems were applied per country or by country, and then an international body was formed. So it was much more of a gradual process. But now, because the technologies are coming online so fast and there's so much and there's so many different players, it's very challenging to create a unified body or even standard to organize.
We've been talking about some of these long-term trends, digitalization, for example. But in the short term here, we're living in COVID-19, and particularly with China, we have a travel ban right now where a lot of many foreigners can't get in. Most foreigners can't get in right now. And how is that playing out for multinational companies that have manufacturing here, who either it's their own operations or maybe contract manufacturing, and they're used to sending their people over to audit and inspect and see how things are going? How are they coping with that?
So one is putting more decision-making power in the local staff, which I think is actually a good thing. Second is it's companies like mine, Tidalwave or FAO Global, who have resources on the ground who will go in on a project or contract basis to help, as you said, either audit or maybe help organize part of the business, make sure things are moving smoothly. Right now we're dealing with a manufacturer who does contract, or with a company that does contract manufacturing with a local Chinese manufacturer. They can't get anybody in the country. It's been 6 months, so we're working with them to devise a plan where we can, help them check up on the manufacturing, make sure things are going smoothly. If there are problems, we can deal with them here in country. But I think a lot of it also is because China has essentially come back online generally, although the demand isn't there, so there's some lag in production and capacity. But a lot of companies are grateful that they actually have business here, because a lot of the businesses here are actually supporting the rest of the world. And we think that at least through the end of the year, it's going to be challenging to get everybody in. Now, of course, if you're a CEO or a high-level manager, you'll probably be able to come in at some point. But, if you're a technician who's working on a special project, or if you are designing new prototypes, you won't be able to come in. So one of our goals is to help those types of companies that need help here on the ground, because we are on the ground. And then really the third thing is there is a level of uncertainty. So nobody quite knows where this is going. When the world had this challenge 100 years ago, there were 3 waves over 2 years. And so now technically we've finished, if not, maybe not finished the first wave. So how does it actually progress? And in different parts of the world, how does it progress? In Europe, of course, they've started bringing people back in larger scales than the US. So we think that will also play a part in it. As long as the flare-ups in North America continue to happen, there won't be as many people being able to come back. So it will be a challenge for business.
So now, Cameron, do you see some manufacturing, we talked about some of the manufacturing maybe slowing down because the global economy is obviously impacted by COVID. Do you see some areas of manufacturing in China ramping up because of COVID or just in general?
One of the industries that's obvious is the medical industry, and it's everything from masks and gloves to thermometers, even ingredients, hand sanitizer. Because of the way COVID evolved, China put in a lot of new capacity. So, for example, at the end of 2019, there were roughly 8,500 factories in China that made some form of what we would consider PPE. Within the first 4 months of the year, there were over 38,000 new companies that came online. Much of that in the beginning was to meet domestic need, and then of course it was exported and domestic need. But we see that, for example, 50% of the world's PPEs now come out of China. And what we see with the U.S., for example, North America, is that they have a lot of supply lines there, but now they're being supplemented. But there are challenges in the supply chain. A lot of the raw materials are in short supply. There's a great concern that if China gets hit again, what happens to all of these manufacturing? As the famous line goes, what will happen to my Tylenol? As an example. So I think those, though, now that people better understand what happened when the first wave of COVID hit, now when the second wave, maybe they can mitigate some of that. I think the other thing is that really, to your point for supply chains, it really shows that we are a global supply chain, no matter what you do.
Mhm.
If a problem happens in China, it will affect everywhere else. If a problem happens in America, it will affect everywhere else. So it really, in many
This
ways,
is decades in the making, right?
well, not only decades, but and to your question earlier, it's now accelerating at rapid speed. And I think what it really shows is, the world is but one country, mankind its citizens.
Mhm.
It's no longer just we have a regional supply chain and we're tied to one or two countries. It's that anything, anywhere can potentially affect us. So when you look at that from a business risk perspective, earlier, this is why a lot of companies are looking at maybe I have a China plus one or plus two, or maybe I have a more regionalized approach, kind of the wheel and spoke that we discussed previously. It's just, I'll have my hub, but then I'll have factories or capacity in other places just to ensure that I can back up and also serve local markets in a more customized way.
Yeah, because I assume no one ever really anticipated that you could have just borders shut off, right? And literally factories that are key in the process, which are irreplaceable, shut down for 2 months, right? Like I don't, in any risk assessment model of a value chain or a manufacturing process flow, had anyone that you know of ever even planned for that contingency?
No, and I think in many ways you're starting to see this kind of back and forth between, one could consider old world principles, right? We have to, we have to have it be this way, and it is, we have to close the border, we have to protect, and then there, of course, there's the new world challenges of, hey, everything's global now.
Yeah.
If I say something today with you, tomorrow it'll be on the internet, global. I mean. Nobody anticipated this, and I think what you're starting to see is, from a standard business point of view, that risk assessment now is going to have to be even more interwoven into the consideration. More than just, hey, we had a trade war between China and the U.S., what was the business risk? Now it's, oh my gosh, if one of our factories goes down, or if half of our factories go down, or if the shipping lanes don't work, what are we going to do? So these are calculations that really were never done on this scale before.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you also, we talked about this again earlier, that we think that maybe this travel restriction may be on until Chinese New Year.
I'm thinking if the U.S. continues to have challenges, I'm thinking Chinese New Year. If it'd be nice to get out this year, but I think realistically, it's not going to happen. And I think the real challenge will be if it continues to happen in North America and not other places. For example, Europe and China may have a travel bubble where they go back and forth with ease, or China and Korea as they have now, these kinds of arrangements. But I think the U.S. will be a challenge for at least the next few months, probably till the end of the year. Yeah. And in many supply chains, we don't see a real change until well into 2021.
Okay.
Just because of the amount of stress and uncertainty in the market.
Yeah, and to be able to reconfigure those supply chains, you kind of have to be everyone back online again.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So thank you, Cameron, for joining us. It's been a real treat. You were actually just recorded to be on Frontline, which I understand is going to come out in roughly October, maybe also about manufacturing PPE in China. So everyone, please check that out, Cameron, on Frontline. And Cameron, it was a pleasure to have you. Really a treat. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Art, and your team, and thanks to CanCan for their sponsorship.
Yeah, so
greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, we want to give a shout out to CanCan. It's the mugs and the logo, and they're a faithful sponsor of ours. And at the end of each episode, we have a tradition here where we do a toast, ganbei. So, Cameron, once again, thanks for joining.
Ganbei.
Ganbei.